All right, good evening. We are back for another D2 and Me Diabetes Support Group meeting. Our speaker today is Roberta Jump. She is the Certified Diabetes Educator for Lexington Medical Center out in Batesburg, Leesville, and also Swansea. Roberta does some great presentations, and today she's going to be talking to us about diabetes and osteoporosis. And with that, I will let you take it away. And if other folks come in, I will go ahead and add them to the chat. All right. Take it away, Roberta.
Hey, wonderful. Welcome, everyone. And thank you for tuning in for diabetes and osteoporosis. I'm going to share my screen and let me share it. All right. Can you see the screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so let me do the slideshow. Okay. All right, so diabetes and osteoporosis, this is condensed from an article from Dr. John Glenn Clark. And this is just a brief synopsis of a longer presentation that he has on his website. And his website is northernlightshealtheducation.com. It's up there on the screen, so you can jot it down. And on his website, he has an actual video that he goes into these things that we're going to talk about in a lot more depth. And then he also has a written article. And in the written article, there's usually he puts over 100 references. And that way, if you want to look up some of the articles and the research that he's used in order to put this presentation together, it's just very heavily documented with research. So hopefully you'll do that. And it's he really goes into a lot more detail. He understands, as a doctor, he understands a lot of the ins and outs more than I would. But we'll try to do our best with just doing the synopsis. So the first question you may have is, what is osteoporosis? And according to the National Institutes of Health, it is a skeletal disorder characterized by compromised bone strength, leading to an increased risk of fracture. Osteo means bone, and then porosis means opening or passage. And as you can see from the photos there, this is a bone that hardly has a whole lot of structure left. And this would be what the bones would look like with a severe case of osteoporosis. So that's the definition of it. And we might like to know who suffers with osteoporosis. Right now, the numbers are about 20 million Americans, but 80% of those are women. We usually see women with more osteoporosis than men. 34 million Americans have osteopenia, and that's a thinning of the bones, which is not quite as bad as the osteoporosis. But if the person doesn't change something, just like with diabetes, you know, osteoporosis will occur, just like someone with prediabetes. If they don't do something about it, they will go ahead and convert to type 2, usually in the future. There are over 2 million osteoporotic occurrences each year, as hip fractures, spine fractures, wrist fractures, and other ones. And the elderly are very, very susceptible to this. But as we'll see, it kind of happens over time. It doesn't happen all at one time. And just like with diabetes, if we catch it in time, we can really make a difference and hopefully reverse it. So what is the diabetes and osteoporosis link? Well, people that have type 1 diabetes particularly, they have a poorer bone quality and increased risk of fractures. And that's usually because they're diagnosed early in life. And anyone that's had poor blood sugar control and people who take insulin, they have the highest fracture risk. So that would automatically include the type 1s that were diagnosed when they were children. And it would also include the type 2s who have to take insulin and really don't control their blood sugar very well. So those are the folks with the highest risk who have diabetes. So as you can see, it really is advantageous to us to try to, if you have diabetes, we definitely want to control the blood sugar. So again, type 1 starts at a young age, and as we get older, as we go from children to young adulthood in our mid-20s, we usually reach peak bone mass. And normally that occurs very well with children as they grow. But again, with type 1, with the higher blood sugars and the insulin, it prevents them from developing peak bone mass. And so that can really affect their chances of developing osteoporosis later in life. We do have some complications of diabetes that might not lead specifically to osteoporosis, but if you have some osteopenia or osteoporosis, and then you have some complications of diabetes, such as nerve damage, if you have a problem with the balance, balance, vision problems, you're more subjective to falls. And then if you have the weak bones and you're falling a lot, you're much more at risk for fractures. So osteoporosis can be devastating. There's a lot of fractures of the wrist, and the person would have to wear a cast for 4 to 6 weeks, and then that sets them up for arthritis in the future. Hyphosis, which is the bones right here in the neck and the spine, they get weak and then they compress, and then the person has a hunch in their back, and as they hunch over more and more, then that does not allow the proper function of the lungs and the gastrointestinal tract. They have reflux, they have trouble breathing, and it's very depressing to them because they really are having a lot of symptoms from, and probably the pain with the spinal fractures too. So you can see that this is something that we want to avoid. Up to 1/3 of hip fracture patients die within the first year because it immobilizes people. They can't move, and so they develop blood clots. They have heart failure, heart issues. They develop pneumonia. Anything pre-existing might get worse because they are not able to move around and walk, at least for a long time. And a lot of times the poor bone health, if they do have a hip fracture, that indicates that the rest of the body might not be as healthy as well. And so the fracture, the hip fracture, the immobilization, and then the poor health all kind of come together, and hip fracture patients, usually a lot of them do not make it within the first year after a fracture. All right. So osteoporosis is usually diagnosed with a DEXA scan, and you get scanned, and then the results are given in standard deviations. So what that means is that you have a general amount of structure to the bone, and that's considered a 0. And if your bones are stronger than that median or that 0, then you're a positive number, like a +1 or a +2. But if your bones are not quite as dense as the standard number, and then you get a score of a -1 or a -2. And so it can go up or it can go down. And if for every standard deviation, there's a 40% increase in mortality from hip fracture. So -1 is 40%, a -2, it even increases even more. So that's why they use DEXA scans a lot of times to see where somebody is, especially women around menopause. They like to get an idea of what is your bone structure at menopause, because as we get older, if we don't do anything to preserve our bone structure with menopause, then we tend to lose bone a lot more rapidly than we did before menopause. So how do bones increase in density or decrease in density, and how does osteoporosis develop? Well, there's 2 good analogies. The first analogy is like a roadway. So if you consider bones like a roadway, if you were going to design a road and you knew, or maybe even a driveway, and you knew that there were not going to be any very heavy vehicles on the roadway and it would not be heavily traveled, you might not want to lay down quite as much asphalt or concrete because you don't need it. But if you're building an interstate and you know that there are going to be a lot of semi trucks and very heavy loads traveling on that interstate, you would go ahead and build up that road. it would be much thicker. You'd use a lot more asphalt and concrete. And so it's kind of the same way with our bones. So our bones are constantly changing. They're under construction like roads. And so we have some types of bone cells called osteoclasts. And what they do is they remove old bone cells that are kind of brittle and, wearing out, basically. So the osteoclasts, they remove the bone, and then the osteoblasts will lay down new bone cells on that bone, but it only lays new bone cells down only when the bone needs it. And so we'll talk about how the bone can need, more of those osteoblasts. We want to have a lot of bone being laid down. So a lot of people think, well, once I manufacture bones, once I develop my bones, then the bone cells, they just stay for the rest of my life, and they don't. They're constantly changing. So there's old bone cells that are dying and getting old, they're being removed, and then new bone cells are being laid down. And osteoporosis happens when more bone cells are being removed and not so many bone cells are being laid down. And so there's something that we can do about that. But that's kind of how it works. It's like a roadway, it's under construction. So there needs to be a calcium balance in the body, and the body is very strict about how it regulates calcium in the bones and in the blood and in the urine. So there's several things that affect our calcium balance. So we get calcium in the foods and drinks that we take in. Some of the calcium is absorbed. If the body needs calcium, the calcium will be absorbed, and what's not needed comes out in the stool. And then the calcium that's absorbed is transferred to the blood and the bones. But like I said, the bones will only, use that calcium if they need to be built up. And then some calcium is excreted in the urine through the kidneys, and we can definitely influence how much calcium we lose out in our urine. But there needs to be a balance. There can't be too much or too little, and the body will pull from the bones if it needs calcium, and it will push calcium out through the stool and the kidneys if there's too much calcium in the body. Or the calcium can be actually calcified and make stones like kidney stones if there's too much. The other analogy with the bones and the body is the calcium bank. So our bones have about 99% of the body's calcium. And again, those osteoclasts make withdrawals and the osteoblasts make deposits. So our goal is to maintain our calcium balance so the deposits are about the same as the withdrawals. So we don't want to lose too much of that bone tissue, bone cells. And so Dr. Clark likes to make this quote: if a man's outgo exceeds his income, then his upkeep will be his downfall. And so it's true with the bones. So this is a question, Miss Alice, I don't know if you want to turn on your speaker or your microphone and you can answer. So what are some things do you think that could lead to calcium withdrawals or make us lose our bone? Any ideas?
Our diet, not drinking the milk.
Our diet has a lot to do with it. Excellent. Any other ideas? Natalie?
Exercise, like the weight-bearing exercise.
Exactly. So yeah, so you've got some really good ideas. So the diet and our exercise are two very, very important things. So the first calcium bank withdrawal is, oh no, sugar. If we have 16 teaspoons of sugar a day, and that's the same as what might be in a 20-ounce soda, right? A Mountain Dew or a Coke. And I know we don't do that with diabetes, but a lot of people do. So 16 teaspoons of sugar a day can increase our calcium loss in our urine by 124%. And if we add chocolate to that, it increases to 147%. Salt can cause fluid retention and increases the kidney's ability to filter, and calcium gets lost that way. And then alcohol, especially when someone drinks alcohol during youth, we know that's when the person is building the bones. So if they drink a lot of alcohol in youth, then that can definitely keep them from reaching their peak bone mass. And that the alcohol starting to drink at a young age may not be reversible. So sugar, salt, and alcohol, those are some withdrawals, and they have to do with our diet. So you're right, Miss Alice. Tobacco affects the hormone system. And so a lot of people don't know this, but the calcium the calcium balance can be disturbed by tobacco. And a lot of kids start smoking, at a young age, or at least they did back when we were kids. And now I think with education, hopefully there's not so many of the children starting to smoke at a young age. Caffeine can increase our urinary excretion of calcium for at least 3 hours after drinking it. And it can also decrease testosterone. And as we said, menopause can definitely affect the bones. We're having some changes in our metabolism, and that affects our bone structure. So here's the exercise you were talking about, Miss Alice. When we exercise, the bone makes electricity. And so that electricity lets those osteoblasts know how many bone cells to lay down. So exercise is extremely critical because it lets the bones know that they do need to become stronger because we're putting stress and pressure on the bones. If we took a calcium supplement all day long and we never exercised, the bones really wouldn't be asking for more of that calcium because we're not putting pressure on them and there's no electricity or little electricity being produced to let the osteoblast know to lay down more bone. So we talked about that second point. So exercise is the most important lifestyle factor in our bone health. If we walk, that decreases our risk by, look at that, 30%. So we don't want to be like this couch potato right here. Sodas, especially the dark ones that contain phosphoric acid. And there's even phosphoric acid in Mountain Dew. And there's some other sodas that are not dark, but the Coke and the Pepsi and the Diet Coke and the Pepsi, that phosphoric acid, in fact, almost any acid, anything that would cause an acid condition in the body will use calcium to neutralize that acid. Just like if we have heartburn and we take a Tums, the Tums is made out of calcium, and that calcium neutralizes the acid in our stomach, and that makes us feel better. It takes away that heartburn. Well, the same thing happens in the body. If we have something that's turning the blood more acidic, the body will pull calcium from the bones in order to neutralize that acid, and then either it will be excreted in the stool or in the urine, or it could cause some kidney stones. Foods with vinegar, which is acetic acid, have been documented to cause osteoporosis. Lemon juice is citric acid, and that does not have that same effect. So I heard a lady talking the other day, and she was saying if you take apple juice and you put lemon juice in the apple juice, then you get the same type of acid that you would want to use in your cooking in place of vinegar. And so it would not be harmful and draw calcium from the bones. If we don't have enough of vitamin D, vitamin K, vitamin B12, and vitamin B6, as well as folic acid, and then our other micronutrients like magnesium, copper, and boron, they can decrease our bone strength and mass, because all of these things help our body to, use calcium and keep it in the bones. And a lot of people with diabetes are very low on their magnesium because we use that for sugar metabolism, or using the sugar, the glucose in the blood. So always make sure to ask your doctor to check the magnesium level, because not only could it, be harmful for other parts of our body, like our heart rate is very dependent upon magnesium. It could also, lack of magnesium could affect our bone health as well. Here's something that a lot of folks don't think about. Stress can raise our stress hormones, and that causes inflammation in the body. Whenever we have inflammation, that could deplete calcium from the bones. So depression, a lot of people are depressed, especially the past couple of years. We've seen a lot more people depressed with all these things that are going on in our society. and that can increase our bone health and our hip fracture risk. And anything else that could be an inflammatory situation like autoimmune, we talked about that last time. Anything that would cause that inflammation could affect the bone health and the calcium balance. And even the Bible says, a merry heart doeth good like a medicine, but a broken spirit dries the bones. So we know that depression can affect our bone health. So what about protein in the diet? These are some really interesting studies, and it kind of shows us that, about the amount of protein that we actually need. And protein varies based on our height and our weight and our activity level and our age. But for the most part, these studies were very good and very comprehensive and showed actual amounts of protein that we would need in order to keep our calcium balance where it needs to be. So if you look at the first, my arrow is going to work. Can you see my arrow? Okay. So if the person ate 47 grams of protein a day, they had about 168 milligrams of urinary calcium that day, but it actually was an increase in the calcium balance. So 47 grams of protein would allow those bones to build back up. If there was osteoporosis going on, then a lower protein level, not too low, but lower protein, plus your exercise, because you want the bones to give off that electrical charge to let the osteoblast know, to lay down more bone mass. But there is a positive calcium balance with 47 grams of protein. What if the person ate 95 grams of protein? Well, we can see that the person had a daily loss of 58 milligrams per day. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but if the person's losing this much calcium every day, or having a loss of calcium every day, the bones are being broken down every day over the course of 10 or 20 years, we can see that person would probably be at risk for bone loss and osteoporosis. If the person ate 142 grams of protein a day, then their calcium loss every day is about 120 milligrams. And so it's almost triple what the person that's eating 95 grams of protein. So just in light of this, what would you think? You can unmute and give me your opinions. What do you think would be the situation of the bone structure of someone that was on a keto diet?
Not good.
Go ahead, Alice.
Not very good.
No.
That's true. Yeah. And a lot of folks, when they go to the personal trainers, they'll say, oh yeah, you have diabetes and, you need this much protein. And a lot of personal trainers will encourage people to eat 100 to 150 grams of protein every day. And we can see that it causes, major bone loss. So, we may not want to stick all the way with 47. You can keep track of your protein, especially if you're using MyFitnessPal or some kind of computer program or app to track your carbs. You can also track your protein just to see, how much protein you're getting. And we'll talk about the type of protein too. So are there any questions about this slide?
No, but very eye-opening.
It is. It really is. Okay. So this is a graphic of hip fractures and osteoporosis. And so over here, we see in the left-hand bottom corner of the graph, we see these countries right here that have a very, very low rate of osteoporosis, hip fractures. And as we increase in our animal protein, we see more and more hip fractures. And we think, well, how can that be? Because, animal protein, that beef and that chicken, it makes us stronger. It helps us to be stronger, but it really can weaken the bones. And we'll see why in just a minute. So animal protein is rich in phosphorus and sulfur. So when we eat animal protein, it's metabolized by the body into sulfuric acid and phosphoric acid. And so we said any kind of acid, with the exception of citric acid, is going to be buffered from the calcium in the bone. So the more animal protein we eat, more phosphorus and sulfur we have, and it's converted into an acid. So the body has to buffer that. So that that creates extra urea, and the urea makes it act like a diuretic. So it hastens the loss of calcium in the urine. So we lose calcium faster when we have more urea, and we get the urea from the animal protein. So you mentioned milk. So in a 12-year study, they studied 77,000 women, and they found that daily consumption of dairy products, increased hip fracture risk by 45%. Now, why is that? Because there's a lot of calcium in milk, right? But only 20 to 40% of the milk calcium is absorbed. And then the milk is high in phosphorus. And so the phosphorus in the animal protein, causes the blood to be more acid. And so it ends up robbing calcium from the bones. And cheese can triple the amount of acid produced by the body. Just because it's so hard to digest, the stomach makes a lot of acid. And so, dairy products can be some of the worst when it comes to the bones. And all of the, and like I said, you may question this, and that's why I refer you to the website so that you can look at these studies and the actual references. And we were all raised to think, oh, we all need to drink milk. But when we look at countries where people don't drink milk after, they nurse when they're babies, but then after they stop nursing, they really don't drink animal milk, and they don't have the hip fractures. So it's really worth looking into, and just studying ourselves to see if who is right. Is it the dairy industry that heavily promotes the dairy products, or is it some of the studies around the world that compare who's got the most hip fractures, who has the most osteoporosis, and what did they eat? So
would almond milk or soy milk or something be better than animal milk? Is that the
yeah, perfect. That's a perfect substitute. And now they have cheese. Daya is a brand that they have cheese made out of plants, and there's 2 or 3 different kinds of yogurts made out. There's one made out of cashew milk, and there's one made out of almonds, and one made out of coconut milk, and soy. There's soy yogurt too. So there's a lot of great products that we can use, on a daily basis or in our cooking and our recipes that can take the place of the cow's milk products. Good question. So here's some other secondary causes of osteoporosis. Sometimes medications like anticonvulsants, methotrexate, heparin, and steroids, they can lead to the bone loss. Kidney failure, we know there's a very close relationship between calcium in the blood and the kidneys and how they function. If we have an overactive thyroid, overactive parathyroid, diabetes, we talked about that, the high blood sugars and the insulin, there's a relationship there. Hypertension, hypercholesterolemia, peptic ulcer disease, and then multiple myeloma. So these are secondary causes of osteoporosis other than the food that we eat and maybe the exercise that we do or don't do, and the stress. So what if we just take calcium supplements? I'm just going to eat what I want and I'll just take some supplements. So they did a study on that too. And they gave 3 groups of people 1,400 milligrams of calcium every day. And group number 1, they ate that lower protein level and they took their supplements. And these are people that had osteoporosis. They were trying to reverse it. So if they ate lower protein and they took the calcium, they gained calcium of 20 milligrams a day. So that shows reversal of the osteoporosis. I think they had them exercise too. So group number 2, they ate 95 grams of protein, but they still lost 30 milligrams a day, even though they were taking the calcium supplements. And then the third group ate that 142 grams of protein a day, and they had a negative 70. So I think without the calcium supplements, group 3, they lost 100 and something milligrams a day. So it did cut down the amount of calcium that they lost, but even with 1,400 milligrams of calcium, which is a lot, they still lost part of their bone by eating too much protein. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So what can cause deposits in our calcium bank? What can help us to help our bodies to not want to take calcium out of the bones? So do y'all like greens? You like to eat greens? Miss Alice, you like greens?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. So any
Yes,
kind of
I do
green,
too.
good. And we see dandelion greens here, and we see lamb's quarters. And that's lamb's quarters, that's actually a green. I don't know if you've ever eaten it, but a lot of people think that dandelion greens and lamb's quarters, those are weeds that need to be cut out of the yard and burned. And these are two very, very healthful things that we can have, and they're free. They grow everywhere. And
Wait a
so they
minute.
can actually help our bones to
Okay, wait a
regain.
minute, Roberta.
Uh-huh.
So lamb's quarters, exactly like they're just growing wild in anybody's yard?
Well, it depends on the part of the country, and it depends on, if they are growing in certain areas, but they're very prolific like dandelions are. So if you find them in an area, they're very likely to really grow, and, cover a lot of ground. I personally have never gathered any. I have battled dandelions in my yard, so I know they're around, but I know that I've seen a lot of videos about lamb's quarters, and not just, the health for the bones, but a lot of other helpful things that these greens do for us. So I don't know if you can go to the nursery and say, hey, I'd like to buy some lamb's quarters. They might look at you funny because most people try to get them out of their yards. But if you can establish them and kind of control them in your yard, they're a very good source of the minerals that we need to help lay down bone. Blackstrap molasses.
The dandelion greens, I want to ask just one question on that. So what do you do with these dandelion greens if you find them, if you have them growing in your yard? Pick them, you wash them, and then what?
Okay, well, you want to make sure that, if wherever you pick them from, you don't want to pick them from a place where you've laid down some, chemicals. You don't want any chemicals in your yard. But if you have a part of your yard, you want to keep some dandelions. You want to get the dandelion greens when they're young because they're a little bit more tender and a little bit more flavorful. But you can use them in salads. You can use them raw. You can cook them like you would any other greens, and they're good with lemon juice on them. Or you can mix them in with other greens and just have a variety of flavors. So you can have them raw, and you can have them cooked. And if you like, you could even put them in a smoothie, maybe with some fruit or other types of veggies.
Okay.
Blackstrap molasses, we really don't hear a lot of people, eating that anymore, but it's a huge benefit to the body. It's got so many great minerals, and it helps the bones. So we can actually use that as a sweetener. It does have carbs in it, but because it's so healthful, we can actually budget those carbs in, to our recipe. Collard greens as well, baked beans, and we can make our baked beans with a sugar substitute, and I like to recommend stevia. So you can make some baked beans, homemade baked beans, without putting too much sugar in there. Sesame seeds, y'all like sesame seeds? And we can use those in salads as well. We can put them in our smoothies. They're excellent. Kale, a lot of people like to eat kale now. Hazelnuts, we don't see those too often around, but they're very, very healthy for the bones. Green soybeans, dried figs, amaranth. I've never used it. I've heard some people say that you have to get used to it, or it's good if you mix it in with other grains, but it is a grain that will not make the blood acid. Wheat and some of the other grains will make the blood a little bit more acid. So if we eat only, wheat stuff all day long, a sandwich for breakfast and pasta for lunch, and, something with wheat for supper, that's a lot of wheat. And that would tend to turn our blood a little bit more acid, not as much as the animal protein, but amaranth is a grain that doesn't make the blood acid. And then carob flour works very well in place of chocolate, or the carob, like the powdered carob. You can use it in a recipe in place of chocolate. because chocolate tends to deplete the calcium in the bones, but carob actually adds, helps the bone to lay down more calcium. And I did discover a trick. If you use carob, your tongue really knows that it's not chocolate. It'll say, I know that's not really chocolate. But if you buy a product called Roma, it is a coffee substitute. It's made out of plant. It's a plant-based, might be made out of grains. I'm not sure, but they're roasted grains. And the only place I found it is online or in the health food store, and it's spelled Roma. So it's just like an instant coffee substitute. If you add a little bit of Roma in with the carob flour, it tastes just like chocolate. I made some Reese's peanut butter cup substitutes with that, and it was amazing how it tasted like chocolate if you added a little bit of the Roma in there. So any questions about any of these foods that can help improve the bone structure?
I don't think so.
Okay. Soy, so you mentioned the plant-based milks, Natalie. And so soy milk, soy is a very good food to help us to build up our bones. So some people say, well, I can't have soy because I had breast cancer, or I have, I've got the genes for breast cancer. And I would suggest that you speak to your doctor about it. The problem with most soy is the amount of processing that's done to it. So there's so much soy eaten in China, and they really don't have a lot of breast cancer over there. So it's not the soy per se, it's more of how they process it. Like if you eat a veggie burger, and I eat them every once in a while, but if you have too much of it, it's just such a concentrated source of soy, and it's processed. So some of the beneficial things in soy are taken out, and maybe some other things are added back. But typically green soybeans, and to a large extent, like an organic soy milk or tofu, that usually is not ultra processed. So it has most of the natural things and the beneficial things for the bone. So talk to your doctor if you feel like you can't have soy because of a breast cancer risk. A lot of women, if they stick with unprocessed soy and have small amounts of it, they don't have issues. Turmeric also has a hormonal effect that helps to preserve our bone mass. And up at the top of the slide, you can see here that they have, they call it golden milk, and they take soy milk and they put a little turmeric in there. And some people like it hot in the evenings, but that combination can really help the bones. And they even put a little ginger in there if you like it spicy. So exercise, as you were mentioning, Miss Alice, if you don't use it, you lose it. And so whenever we walk and do our weight bearing is very important, because whenever we put stress on those bones, then that sends out the electrical signals to our osteoblasts, will bring more bone cells and lay down more bone cells on our bone. And they've seen actually some reversal of osteoporosis if the persons are having more of their calcium bank deposit type things and avoiding the withdrawal type things. Vitamin D.
I was going to say, Alice had a question about walking and weight bearing exercises.
Okay, go ahead, Miss Alice.
So the weight bearing activity is just walking, or are you talking about doing actual weights? And are doing weights like lifting with your hands or feet, is that better for you than the walking?
They're both they're both extremely important. So walking will really help avoid hip fractures because you're putting more weight bearing on the hips in that area. But you also definitely want to do weightlifting. And if you're not sure of where to start or how to do it, you could always talk to a personal trainer, but don't eat all the protein they tell you to eat. So you can do upper body and lower body, and anything that we do to put stress and pressure on our bones will cause that electricity and help the bone to take up more density. So it's good to do both. And the walking is also good for cardiovascular. So that's a great question. Thank you, Miss Alice. Vitamin D, we need 20 minutes a day with 25% of our skin exposed to the sun. No sunscreen. That should be sufficient in the summer. In the winter, we need to get out more in the middle of the day and maybe get a little bit more sun than we need in the summer. There's one good rule of thumb, and that's if your shadow is longer than you, then the sun will not give you enough vitamin D. Your shadow has to be very short in order to get the benefit of the vitamin D. A lighter skinned person might get all the vitamin D they need 15 to 20 minutes a day. The darkest skinned person might need more like 40 minutes. So one good thing to do is also ask your doctor to check your vitamin D levels. And vitamin D and diabetes are so closely related. I see so many patients with diabetes and their vitamin D levels are so low, and their immune systems are really impaired. They get sick more often. So the lab says that your vitamin D level should be at least 30, but a lot of these lifestyle physicians, Dr. Clark, he's an orthopedic surgeon, and he and some of the other experts that are lifestyle physicians are saying that vitamin D should be at least 50. The level should be at least 50. And if your vitamin D level is good, that's really going to protect your bones and your immune system too. So it's an all-around good thing to have your vitamin D where it needs to be. I would check vitamin D at least twice a year. You want to know what it is going into the summer, and you want to know what it is going into the winter. Most people find that at the beginning of summer, their vitamin D levels are lower because they really haven't spent that much time outside in the winter. And then a lot of people have an adequate vitamin D level in the fall going into the winter because they've been outside in the summer. So try to get your doctor to check it twice a year if possible. And that way you know how to supplement or how much to supplement.
I had mine checked, Alice, by my primary care physician. She checks it. And my vitamin D had been low like in years past, and then we just stopped following up on it. And so she thought, maybe let's go back and start looking at it again. And where you were saying it should be around what, 30?
The lab says it should be 30, but it should actually be higher than 50.
Mine was like 7.
7?
7.
70?
No, 7. 0, 7.
7.
Yeah.
Oh my.
I was like, is that good? And she was like, no, that's not good. That's horrible. And so then I had to get back on, she put me on vitamin D prescription pills. Right. And when I came back the next time, I think I had to come back in 3 months or 6 months. And it was, way higher than that. After that, I was in the double digits, well into the good range. But so much so that she said, I was taking them I was supposed to take them every week, I think, once a week. And she cut me down to at least every 10 days or 2 weeks if I wanted to. So I take them every 10 days now. And so we'll probably check it again when I go back in probably 6 months and see whether I can cut it down, maybe back, something a little less frequent. But it was through the roof. I mean, I started out at 7.
Yeah, that's really low. And some of the latest research is showing that a lot of people with low vitamin D levels, they tend to get more COVID and more severe COVID than people that have vitamin D levels of 50 or greater. The sun is really the best source of vitamin D. When we take it by mouth, that's good because we don't want to leave our level too low. But if we get it from the sun, what the sun does is it makes the vitamin D out of the cholesterol in our body. So there's other good things that happen, but it also lowers our cholesterol level, increases the D and decreases the cholesterol level. So sun is important, but if we can't get it, the vitamin D level where we need to just from the sun, then supplementation is a good idea. So that's good that your doctor's on it, Natalie. That's good.
Yes, ma'am. She is on it.
Excellent. All right. So we want to watch our animal protein. We don't have to cut it completely out, and we don't have to cut out our refined grains, but we just want to know that every time we have the animal protein and the refined grains, the white flour, the white rice, that kind of thing, that's going to be a challenge to our bones. A lot of people say, well, I can't eat plant protein. I want to be strong. The strongest animals on the planet eat plants, like the elephants. So we can be strong. And a lot of triathletes now are eating more plant protein. We want to eat more of foods that do not produce acid. And just as a group, they're fresh fruits, vegetables, nuts, and beans. So if we have a lot of these things in our diet, we tend to not eat so much of the things that might be calcium robbers. And that's how we should kind of plan our meals. And with people with diabetes, we may not be able to have tons of fruit all day. We have to count it, as part of our carbohydrate, but we can definitely have plenty of those greens and the other non-starchy vegetables that will actually build up our bones. And then try to really limit the calcium thieves, which would be sugar. And we're doing that with diabetes anyway. Chocolate, too much salt. Might want to use the Himalayan pink salt. There's some minerals in that. Caffeine, alcohol, tobacco, soda, the dark sodas, chronic stress, and depression. So those are the things that will actually help our bones. These exercise, and then these foods right here: fruits, vegetables, nuts, and beans. So any questions? That's all I have. How we doing on time?
We're doing very good. We are like 10 minutes ahead.
Okay, good. Well, I encourage you again to look at the video on Northern Lights Health Education. He has a lot of other slides. He has more graphs and charts, and then the handouts have the references. So if you want to, dig in a little bit deeper, it's really amazing how our body responds to what we eat and the way we exercise. And it's very comforting to know that we can reverse osteopenia and osteoporosis. And it does take some work, and it's not the typical American diet, but we definitely don't want to get to the point where we have some fractures and we can't move around. And I want to live as long as I can, as healthy as I can.
That's true.
How about you?
I agree with that. I do have a question. I think you had mentioned about smoking and how that affects bone mass.
Uh-huh.
And you were talking about when the kids start smoking earlier and earlier. Well, now they do all this vaping.
Yeah.
How does that affect bone mass? Have there been any studies on that?
I don't know. That's a really good question. If the culprit is nicotine, then it would be a worse situation with vaping, because a lot of these kids are loading more nicotine into those vape pens, a lot more than a cigarette would give. And if it's the nicotine, then that would be even worse. But if it's something else that's in the cigarettes, then the vaping probably wouldn't have that. So that's a question, and I don't know the answer to. But I do remember listening to a lecture from Dr. Kevin McCauley, and he runs a very successful addiction recovery out in Utah. And he made the statement that really surprised me. He said, the number one drug that kills most young people is nicotine, and it's because of the vaping, because they just load the pens up with such a concentrated amount of nicotine, just stops their heart.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And what about the use of apple cider vinegar? You had mentioned that foods with vinegar could be a cause of osteoporosis. What about using apple cider vinegar mixed with water?
Yeah, apple cider vinegar is acetic acid, which is causes more acid in the body, which would hurt the bones. And that's why the lady that I was listening to, when she was talking about that in the lecture, she said if you add a little lemon juice to apple juice, you still have that same quality of the apple, with the acid, but it's citric acid instead of acetic acid. And citric acid won't hurt the bones, but you can use it, like if a recipe calls for vinegar, you can use apple juice and lemon juice together, and it will give you that same effect as the apple cider vinegar.
Okay.
And that's not saying that we shouldn't have any, but if we know, okay, these things will cause a lot of acid in my body to hurt my bones, and these things are going to be helpful, you can say, well, if I'm going to have a serving of apple cider vinegar, then I might want to have maybe a soy-based food instead of an animal-based food. And you can do those trade-offs. That helps us to say, well, I don't want to live the rest of my life never having vinegar on my greens. You might like that. But if we know what's helpful and we know what's hurtful, and we can balance it in, then that makes us feel like, okay, I can handle this life with, minimizing something as opposed to taking something completely out.
Because I like drinking like a little bit of apple cider vinegar with about 8 ounces of water in the mornings.
Uh-huh.
It kind of keeps me from being as hungry first thing in the morning because I usually don't start eating until about 12:30 or so.
Uh-huh.
So I was just wondering, how that would affect my bones drinking
Well,
that each day.
yeah, you might want to get a baseline DEXA scan and
Mhm.
see where you are right now, and then maybe do it again in a year. And if you see a decrease, then you can say, okay, let me pull that slideshow out and and see what I might need to start, decreasing, maybe not taking out completely, but decreasing. And if you like apple cider vinegar in the morning and some water, but maybe you can have some beans for supper, beans and greens instead of an animal protein, then your calcium balance for the day might be good because you have something a little bit acid, but you had something a little bit more alkaline on the other end, and it might balance out for you. But I think a good way to monitor that is to have the baseline DEXA scan and then see how you do, however often your doctor wants to check that.
Okay, and you could be any age to get a DEXA scan done?
Well, you can to get a doctor's order. I don't know if you have to talk the insurance company into it. But really, it's the only way that we know how, our bones are doing. And it's much better to catch a little bit of bone loss early than to wait until you're 50 or 60 or whenever your insurance wants to start paying for a bone scan. And then, I've got some osteopenia. I really need to double time to try to reverse that. It's better to catch it early when you might go one standard deviation below the norm, and then you can climb back from that a lot easier than if you're 4 standard deviations.
I agree with that.
And if your insurance company says no, just ask to speak with their manager and ask to speak with their manager and work your way to the top. Hey, would you like to pay for a hip fracture? No. Okay, well, give me a little DEXA scan here.
There you go. Exactly. Exactly. Well, Miss Alice, did you have any other questions?
No, I thought that was very good. Thank you for taking the time.
Yes.
My
Very
pleasure.
good as usual, Roberta.
My pleasure.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Well, I hope you have a great evening, and we'll see you again in a few months, I think.
All right. Y'all have a good evening.
All right. Okay. Bye now.